Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we finished up Unit 7, which spanned 1890 to 1945. And today we are going to begin talking about Unit 8, which covers from 1945 all the way to 1980. And specifically today, we're going to talk about the Cold War and the Second Red Scare. Now, I want you to buckle up because this presentation is full of a lot of awesome information. So, if you are ready, let's begin. All right, let's talk about the origins of the Cold War. After World War II ends, the differences between the United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union, Russia, and its countries that are aligned with Russia, okay, those differences are going to be heightened. So the Soviet Union is going to be is going to be known as an authoritarian communist country. So this, if you don't know what communism is, this is a classless system where the means of production, like the factories, are owned by everybody. And what we mean by that is they're kind of like owned by their government and they're distributed. And nobody has any private property. That's like the pure definition of communism. And the United States is a capitalist democracy, and this is where elections are used to put leaders in place, and people own their own means of production and property. We have private property in the United States and capitalism, right? So these two ideas of economy and government are very different from one another. And so we need to have that base understanding as we get through the Cold War. So one of the big questions that America is going to be thinking about, and you can kind of keep in your head with the Cold War, is the enemy of your enemy your friend, or is it your enemy? Because the United States is going to support a lot of people in a lot of countries that maybe don't have the best intentions just because they are the enemy of the USSR and the Soviet Union. All right. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, one really important idea that we need to understand, start of this one, is the idea of containment. So throughout the entire Cold War, the United States policy is going to be containment, which means that they want to keep communism from spreading. They want to keep communism where it is, and they don't want any other country to become communist. And that guy pictured on the right is George Kennan. He's the father of containment. This is essentially the idea. And also, just one more thing about the Cold War. Some people want to know why it's called the Cold War. Well, the Soviet Union and the United States never actually fight directly against each other. That's why it's called a Cold War, because it's a lot about diplomatic and military tensions. And there's proxy wars, but there's not actually a direct war between them. Okay, so this is a map of the Cold War. Okay, and so you can kind of see all the countries that are blue are aligned with the United States in one way or another, and all the countries that are red are aligned with the USSR or the Soviet Union in one way or another. And all those stars are where we're going to see major conflicts throughout the Cold War. And we're going to talk about a few important ones in this unit. And so we'll get going. So, first thing about the Cold War is this idea called the Iron Curtain. So the Iron Curtain is a fictional line that divided communist Europe from non-communist Europe. So you can kind of see it in that map there. The red would be communist, the blue would be not communist. And this idea is going to be articulated by a speech by the Prime Minister Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom in 1946. And it's important to know this last idea here. So, this last bullet is that communism is going to be viewed as a totalitarian idea. It's going to be issued by authoritarian governments that don't give their people a lot of choice. And so, the U.S. and Western Europe is going to be very afraid of the threat of the Soviet Union and of other countries becoming communist. So, that's important to know. So, how is the U.S. going to try to stop this? Obviously, the goal, we know this, we should know this, this is important. The goal of the U.S. foreign policy is to counteract the Soviet Union, establish security in case of Soviet or communist threats, to contain communism. And what are some examples of how the U.S. is going to try to contain communism? Well, they have this idea of collective security, meaning all democratic countries, capitalist countries, are going to work together. One example of that is NATO. And we're still in NATO. Okay. So NATO, the idea is an alliance system, and an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. And they all promise to go to war if any of them are attacked. You know, this is still a thing. If you think about the war with Russia and Ukraine is not a part of NATO, which is one of the reasons why Russia today was able to attack Ukraine without major repercussions from the world, without going to war with all these other countries. So NATO is brought up in the Cold War right after World War II. And another way that the U.S. is going to try to counteract the Soviet Union is through international aid, money. So first one is probably the more they're both important. The first one I would start though. Okay, so it's called the Marshall Plan. And this is a plan to give billions of dollars to Europe to rebuild countries that were destroyed in the war. And they're going to rebuild them in the model of the United States with democracy and with capitalism without communism. Okay, so that's the Marshall Plan. Important to know how we're using money to rebuild world Europe in the vision of the United States. And then there's the Truman Doctrine. We've heard about the Monroe Doctrine before, right? The Truman Doctrine is President Truman's ideas, and he's going to give $400 million in military aid to Greece and Turkey. Again, trying to make sure that they become democratic capitalist countries, not communist. So that's a kind of example of the Marshall Plan. All right. And then the last is some economic institutions, which are going to try to help out countries becoming capitalist. And the most famous example of this is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. That's made in 1944, and it promotes trade and gives out loans to countries in need. And again, that's giving money so that countries are more likely to be capitalist. So we're using money, we're using the threat of war. Those are kind of the two main ways that we're trying to contain the Soviet Union. Now, how are we trying to contain communism? We've talked a lot about containment. So first, there are going to be military engagements, and there's going to be one in Korea we'll talk about today briefly, and there's going to be another in Vietnam that we'll talk much more about later. And this all goes to what's called the domino theory. So if you think about a game of dominoes, okay, so the fear is that if one country falls to communism, then the other countries around it will as well. And so we want to stop any country from becoming communist, okay? Another way the United States is going to contain communism is through this idea of massive retaliation. That the mutually assured destruction is another way to put this, okay? The United States is going to respond with a ton of force if attacked. So if the U.S. is attacked, the Soviet Union needs to know we are going to have nukes ready to go. We are going to have a massive retaliation. Lastly is the space race. So one thing that happens, the USSR, the Soviet Union, are actually the first country that launches a satellite to space. That's Sputnik. And it's just kind of like a satellite. It's nothing, doesn't do anything harmful, okay? But it freaks America out. And they send the first man to space, this guy on the left, Yuri Gagarin, probably pronouncing his name wrong, okay? So this is really scaring the United States. And so the US responds by building up their space program, by emphasizing education, by emphasizing the role of science and math and education to beat the Soviet Union in the space race. So these are all kind of ways that we are trying to contain communism. Okay, so as far as the Cold War goes, the history of the Cold War, because it spans from about like 1945 all the way to 1980 in different ways, but it fluctuates between periods of intense military confrontation and mutual coexistence with this idea of détente. It's a vocab word that we need to know. We'll talk about it a little bit at the end of this. So military confrontations. We talked about that there's the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Today, we're going to focus a little bit on the Korean War. Now, AP doesn't emphasize this as much as the Vietnam War, but it's still very important to know. So the Korean War, you can see pictured on the top left, is from 1950 to 1953. And what this war is all about is that at the end of World War II, Japan had been occupying Korea, but Japan is forced to give it up. And the Soviets kind of take charge of the north, and the United States takes charge of the southern portions. And both sides are hoping and planning that Korea can be a unified nation and have one government on their own. But the U.S. really doesn't want Korea to become communist. We also have to remember China is also communist, their neighbor, okay? So there's going to be intense tensions that are going to rise. And eventually, North Korean military is actually going to go and invade South Korea, okay? And the North, again, is supported by communists in the Soviet Union and in China. And the South is supported by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the United Nations, okay? President Eisenhower, president after World War II, is going to send United States troops, our soldiers, to support the South, okay? While the Soviet Union is going to send their soldiers to support the North. Now, the war goes on for 3 years, but essentially it ends with a ceasefire, okay? It ends with a stalemate where they agreed to that line called the 38th parallel. Sorry, the 38th parallel, my mistake. Okay, and this is the line that divides North and South Korea, and it still divides North and South Korea to this day. Okay, so South Korea, important to note, does not end up becoming communist, but this is an example of a war between the Soviet Union and the United States, how they're both trying to fuel other countries that are fighting, okay, to be more like them, right? The Soviet Union want them to be communist. We want them to be democratic and capitalist. All right. Another example of a military confrontation is the Cuban Missile Crisis, October of 1962. This is under JFK, John Kennedy, okay? And the U.S. basically finds out that the Soviet Union is giving Cuba nuclear weapons, or wants to give Cuba nuclear weapons. There's some suspicion of this, and Cuba is very, very close to the United States. Like people have swam from Cuba to Florida. Okay? It's very close. So JFK responds by creating a naval blockade of Cuba, which ends up forcing the Soviets to remove the missiles. And with a deal where the United States agrees to remove some missiles they have from Turkey. But the main idea here is that this is very close from the United States and the USSR for coming to war. This is probably the closest America and the Soviet Union ever got to coming to war. And there were some advisors on JFK's side that wanted us to attack. Okay, so this was very close, but we managed to negotiate our way out of this without having a direct confrontation. And the last idea here is we got to know this vocab word. So star this one. It's called détente. And it is the idea of the easing of tensions between the two superpowers, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And one way they're going to do this is SALT. It's a funny name, but basically it's strategic arms limitation talks. So this just means that they are going to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that the countries have. Okay, so this begins with Richard Nixon and it goes through Jimmy Carter's administrations, but the idea is to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. All right, another idea in the Cold War is post-war decolonization. So as many countries in Asia and Africa and the Middle East start to become independent, they have to decide their government. And the United States and the Soviet Union, the USSR, are going to seek allies among these new nations. One big ally of the United States is Israel. This is still a very strong ally of the United States. We immediately recognized Israel in 1948, which is a Jewish state that gets founded after World War II. And a lot of revolutions in certain countries where governments were overthrowing where people were overthrowing their government. A lot, if they become communist, we see these as pawns of the Soviet Union, right? So there's all this tension, but America's doing the same thing. We're inspiring revolutions and putting in our own governments, that are like us. All right. With that said, a lot of countries remain non-aligned. So not every country does ally with the United States or the Soviet Union, but the United States and the Soviet Union are both really trying to get countries to ally with them. So let's think about specifically how this happens in Latin America. So there's this quote here from AP that we should know. The U.S. would often support non-communist regimes that had varying levels of commitment to democracy. So this is the whole enemy of my enemy is my friend. So for example, in Guatemala in 1954, the United States helps overthrow the elected government, the guy in charge of this guy, Arbenz in Guatemala. He was democratically elected, okay? He had nationalized the land, though. That's kind of a communist idea. And he had taken over some land that was owned by a United States company called the United Fruit Company. And so we help out a revolution, and we put in power this guy, Carlos Castillo Armas, who's pictured on the left. And he's a military dictator. He's a brutal guy. But again, he supports the United States, so we're okay with that. So that's one example of that idea. All right, so we've talked a lot about foreign policy, okay, so far, but the Cold War also has an impact on what's going on inside the United States, and that's through what's called the Red Scare. Now, we already talked about one Red Scare in this course, but this is the second Red Scare, and this is the same thing, fear and hysteria over communism, but this is the 1940s and 1950s. As you see, communism is a huge aspect of U.S. foreign policy, so it's going to make sense that we're also going to be looking for communists inside the United States. So a lot of people are going to be afraid that the U.S. government is going to be infiltrated by communists, that communists are trying to take over the U.S. government. And so what are some reasons for the second Red Scare? Well, like we talked about, the USSR, the Soviet Union, they are trying to convince countries in Eastern Europe to be like them, and they're taking countries, over in the sense of having aligned governments to them, okay? China becomes communist in 1949. So that's another reason why America gets scared. And the Soviet Union, they developed their own nuclear weapons. So it's a clear threat to the United States in terms of superpower status. In the 1940s, the Red Scare gets started with something called HUAC, okay? You should know this term. You should know this acronym, or you should know the whole name. House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC. All right, so star this one. So a prominent member of this organization is actually going to be Richard Nixon. And the idea of this committee is they're trying to investigate and find people who are not loyal to the United States inside the government or inside the United States, okay? And out them, right? Make sure people know about them and punish them. Alger Hiss is an example of somebody who gets caught by the HUAC, the HUAC. All right. So Alger Hiss, pictured on the left was an aide to FDR, but he's accused of sharing 65 different classified documents with communists, and he's indicted and sentenced to 5 years in jail for perjury. So basically for lying under oath about his role in that. Another example of the Red Scare is the Hollywood 10. This was basically 10 screenwriters that Hollywood was often thought of a lot of communists in Hollywood and entertainment business. Okay, so these are 10 screenwriters that refused to testify before this House committee. Okay, and they were sentenced to jail. So we see some pressure there. And the last example I have for you is Truman's loyalty program, where Harry Truman, the president, during the end of World War II, he issues an executive order that he asks all federal employees to take a loyalty oath. So we can kind of see a lot of these ideas in the 1940s with the Red Scare about trying to find people who might be communists, who might be trying to damage America's status, being found out about and being punished. In the 1950s, it gets even more extreme. We have something called the McCarran Internal Security Bill. This is a bill that gets passed over Truman. Truman actually tries to veto it, but it gets passed. Okay. And this says that communist organizations inside the United States, they have to register with the government. So America has to find out who all the communists are if this is a belief system that you have. And some people are going to feel like this is starting to go against American values of free press and freedom of thought. All right. Now, probably the most famous example of the Red Scare, and a name you should definitely know, is Joseph McCarthy. Okay. And his idea, it gets to be called McCarthyism after him. Now, he's a Republican senator from Wisconsin, but he is seen as a demagogue. And what does that mean? He's a leader that capitalizes on false claims to gain power. And he is going to accuse a lot of people in the State Department, which is the department of government that controls foreign policy, of being communist. And he's going to get a lot of people all riled up, and he's going to blame a lot of people. Okay. However, it sweeps the nation, right? But a lot of people start to think that McCarthy maybe is going a little too far. And that's one important thing to know is when he starts to accuse the army of being communist, people kind of turn against him. And the Red Scare sort of slowly starts to die out as far as us worrying so much about communists inside the United States. In English class, you might have read The Crucible by Arthur Miller. This is going to be an allegory to McCarthyism. So The Crucible is a book all about the Salem witch trials, but it's really about the Red Scare. It's written during that time. It's really about finding communists. And the last example I have for you about the Red Scare is the Rosenbergs. They're another famous example pictured on the bottom left. They are the husband and wife couple, and they were convicted of giving atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. And there's, again, some, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. There's not a whole bunch of clear evidence, but they are convicted of doing it. All right. So the last thing for today is the effect of the second Red Scare. Obviously, it's having a huge impact on American society and culture. So what are the effects? Well, first is blacklisting. There's going to be a refusal to hire certain workers. Hundreds of workers, especially in Hollywood, are never hired because of their ties to communism and communist thinking. We're going to see violations of people's constitutional rights. And again, this is a general idea for this whole course. In times of war, in times of crisis, individual rights decrease. And we see people trying to accuse each other of being communists. And again, we see a lot of violations of people's constitutional rights because of what they get accused for, because of jail time they have to serve. A fun kind of example or an interesting example of this is on the left. If you're into baseball, the Cincinnati Reds, red is like a communist color. They call themselves, it's often associated with communism. They changed their name to the Cincinnati Redlegs because they don't want to be associated with communism. That's how far this idea of communism and being afraid of communism gets into the United States. And the last thought I have for you as an effect of the second Red Scare is the Supreme Court case Dennis versus the United States in 1951. And this makes it illegal to teach the violent overthrow of the government inside schools. Okay, so again, we see the second Red Scare really has a dramatic impact on the United States society and culture. All right, that is it. I know that was a lot today, but that's it for our notes on the Cold War from 1945 to 1980 and the Red Scare. Those are two really big topics, but let's make sure we can synthesize because that was so much. Okay, so let's get these down. Big ideas. Number one, describe America's Cold War strategy. How is America trying to contain communism? Give a specific example. Number two, describe a specific effect of the Cold War. And number three, what were the causes and effects of the second Red Scare? Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.